Hello and welcome back to the channel. We'll be doing a useful charts video on Anglo-Saxon Kings family tree, England's Dark Ages. So we're going from about 410 to about 950, 927. So it does depend depending on who you ask. And yeah, so this isn't the entirety of the Anglo-Saxon kings, but it goes through all of the houses. So Mercia, East Anglia, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, Kent, and Northumbria. And yeah, so let's get on with the video.
Hi, this is Jasmine from the YouTube channel A Long Time Ago. Today I'll be guest narrating for useful charts in order to show you the family tree of the Anglo-Saxon monarchs. In Matt's video on the British monarchy, he started with Alfred the Great and then traced the line all the way back down to Queen Elizabeth II.
So just to add a point here, this is an older video. So this family tree does go up to Queen Victoria, but it also goes to Charles, but not as much.
But we can actually trace the royal line several hundred years further back. You see, prior to the emergence of the Kingdom of England...
Now, actually, the Kingdom of England was started by Alfred the Great, and that's why they often go back to him.
Alfred's ancestors ruled over a kingdom known as the Kingdom of Wessex. Wessex was just one of 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that existed in England prior to, well, England. So today I'm going to show you the family tree of some of the most important monarchs who ruled during the Anglo-Saxon period.
Honestly, I love this intro.
Let's start with some background. From 43 to 410 CE, the area now known as England was a province of the Roman Empire called Britain.
Yes, so Roman Britannia, which then later became the name of the entirety of Britain. You had the Gaels and the Picts, who were Celt tribes living in modern-day Scotland and Ireland, and the Hadrian's Wall was the cut-off between the Picts and the British.
And it was mostly inhabited by a group of Celtic people known as the Britons. However, in the year 406, things started to change. In that year, Germanic armies crossed the Rhine River for the first time and started to take over the Western Roman Empire.
It was the fall of the Roman Empire when large amounts of Germanic tribesmen stormed the Western Roman Empire, and took Rome in 410. Well, a little bit after 410.
The Romans were no longer able to keep troops in Britain and therefore abandoned the province. Sometime after this, Germanic tribes started to invade the shores of Great Britain, although there is evidence that some Germanic peoples arrived before this time as well. These Germanic invaders came from 3 main tribes: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. It is from the Angles...
So the Angles and the Saxons came from Denmark and Germany and the Netherlands, and the same with the Jutes, but the Jutes weren't as numerous as the Angles and the Saxons.
And the Saxons that we get the term Anglo-Saxon, and from the Angles that we get the word English. Over time, through a process of migration and assimilation, the language and culture of the area went from being primarily Brittonic to being primarily Anglo-Saxon, with many Britons being put...
And that is how it became a Germanic language compared to a Britannic language.
Into what is today Wales. Eventually, 7 main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged: the Anglic kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, the Saxon kingdoms of Wessex, Essex, and Sussex, meaning West Saxons, East Saxons, and South Saxons, and the Jutish kingdom of Kent. This is why this period is also sometimes called the Heptarchy, meaning the 7 kings. In reality, though, there was never a time in which all 7 kingdoms were equally strong. For example, throughout much of the Anglo-Saxon period, Mercia was the dominant power, and then eventually...
Well, yeah, Mercia held a lot of power because it was very large, And then you had Essex, which held London at the time, and is a county in its own right these days. And Wessex still exists, and so does Sussex, just not in their large degrees, and so does Kent, but shrunk often. And Northumbria actually does still exist, and they're now just counties which have their own foothold but not ruling class.
It was Wessex. Okay, let's now return to the family tree. At the top, you can see the names of the 7 kings who were credited with having established the royal lines associated with each of the 7 kingdoms. On this chart, yellow represents the 3 Anglic kingdoms, red the 3 Saxon kingdoms, and purple the single Jutish kingdom.
Yeah, so this is why I said they were less numerous, and actually more Angles and Saxons lived in Kent than Jutes.
However, please note that the coats of arms you see above each line did not actually exist at the time. Heraldry...
No, these are more ones which were created afterwards, because we don't know the original coat of arms.
It wasn't really a thing until 600 years later, during the High Middle Ages. So each of the shields you see here are simply later inventions that were attributed back to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, long after they were gone. Another later invention that was attributed back to the early Anglo-Saxon kings was the title of Bretwalda, which literally means Britain ruler, and which was kind of a similar title to that of High King. Although the title probably didn't exist initially, later chronicles assigned it...
It was probably made around the 5th, maybe 6th century at the latest. Not 5th and 6th, 5th and 600s, because that's when the language started to develop from Anglo-Saxon.
To the various Anglo-Saxon kings, who were thought to have been the dominant ones. So, for example, the first 4 Bretwalders were said to have been Alla of Sussex, Cheolin of Wessex, Athelbert of Kent, and Radwald of East Anglia.
Yes.
King Athelbert of Kent is notable in that he was the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity. This was largely due to...
And that is why he is now a saint.
The fact that he married a Merovingian princess, the woman now known as Saint Berta. However, his actual conversion is credited to Saint Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with the more famous Saint Augustine of Hippo. Note that the current leader of the Church of England is known as the Archbishop of Canterbury, a title...
And that is actually because of him. So actually, because a lot of bishops tried to convert the kings at the time, this Bishop of Canterbury actually tried to convert everyone in the country to become some form of Christian, and at the time that would have been Catholic.
That traces its origins back to the Augustine who converted Athelbert. Athelbert was also supposedly a direct descendant of Hengist. Hengist and Horsa being the 2 legendary brothers who were said to have led the initial Anglo-Saxon invasion.
But we have no evidence that they actually existed.
For the remainder of this video, we are going to focus on the 3 largest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria. Let's start with Northumbria. Northumbria was originally 2 kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira. However, Bernicia and Deira eventually merged due to a rather messy sequence of events. To explain, let's start around the year 600, which happens to be around the time that King Athelbert of Kent became the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity. Around this time, the king of Bernicia was a man named Athelthryth, and the king of Deira was a man named Athelric. The exact details are unclear, but it seems that Athelthryth eventually conquered Deira, perhaps killing Athelric in the process.
Now, these are unclear because a lot of these records where we try to get this knowledge from are made 2, maybe 300 years after the Dark Ages initially ended. So we kind of have to take this with a grain of salt, and from someone who may not even know anyone who has any family links to anyone at the time.
Led to Athelric's brother Edwin being exiled, where he eventually wound up in the court of King Radwald of East Anglia. Athelthryth thus became the first king of both Bernicia and Deira. However, after about a decade of ruling over both kingdoms, Athelthryth was attacked by the armies of Radwald. Radward killed Athelfrith and placed his ally Edwin on the throne instead, thus making Edwin the second king to rule both Bernicia and Deira.
Yes, and I think he was the one who actually created it. But Northumbria is also well known at this point for being rich and powerful.
Around the same time, King Athelbert of Kent died, leaving Radward as the most powerful king, and hence the new Bretwalda. I should also point out that Radward is thought to have been the owner of the Sutton Hoo helmet, an ornately decorated...
Yes, so this was discovered, I think it must have been, 30 years ago now? And I've actually gone to see it, and it is beautiful, and it is one of the most well-preserved Saxon helmets of the time.
Helmet found in a ship grave during an archaeological excavation in 1939.
Oh.
Anyway,
Oh,
Edwin eventually married the daughter of Athelbert of Kent, and as a result, he too converted to Christianity. When Radward died, Edwin became the fifth Bretwalda, but fighting continued between the kingdoms, and eventually Edwin was killed by King Penda of Mercia, who had allied
So
with
as
the
you can
Welsh...
see, it's already very complex, and we don't actually know a lot about this age, but what we do know is a lot of these kings, as they were called, are more like dukes and have or earls, and kind of ruled over it, but there was some sort of power between the entire country, which wasn't really known, but it was as well. It was a very weird time.
King Cadwallon. At this point, Bernicia and Deira were once again split into two kingdoms, with Edwin's kinsman Osric taking Deira, and Athelfrith's son, Eanfrith, taking Bernicia. Note that Athelfrith had actually married Edwin's sister,
Yes.
Atcha, and thus Eanfrith was Edwin's nephew. However, the Welsh king Cadwallon continued to attack Bernicia and Deira, and eventually managed to kill both Osric and Eanfrith. Later chroniclers would blame this on the fact that both Osric and Eanfrith had reverted their lands back to paganism. The stage was thus set for the sixth Bretwalda, Eanfrith's brother Oswald. During Edwin's reign, both Eanfrith and Oswald had been exiled to Scotland, where they converted to Christianity. But unlike Eanfrith, who dropped his new faith upon becoming king, Oswald remained Christian.
Yes.
According to legend, he stuck a large wooden cross in the ground before a battle against Cadwallon.
And actually, that was seen as the reason why he lost. Or was it because... I can't remember actually now.
And for this reason, was able to win back both Bernicia and Deira. Whether or not this is actually true, what is true is that during his reign, Christianity became firmly entrenched in England.
And it kind of became the national religion of the time.
After his death, Bernicia and Deira were split for one final time. Oswin, son of Osric, took Deira, and Oswy, brother of Oswald, took Bernicia.
Yes.
But eventually, Oswy had Oswin killed and managed to take hold of Deira. Thus, in the year 654, Bernicia and Deira were formally merged to create the Kingdom of Northumbria.
So easily, we're already 200 years into this, and one of the major ones have only just been created. That's how complex a lot of this time was.
The rule of Oswy. In order to cement the deal, Oswy married Eanflad, the daughter of Saint Edwin. Thus, Oswy became the seventh and final Bretwalda.
Yes.
However, the main thing Oswy is remembered for is defeating Penda, king of Mercia, at the Battle of Wynward. Penda was the last major pagan king to rule over an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and his death at the Battle of Wynward is seen as the end of pre-Christian England. Oswy was followed by Edgefrith, a son of Eanflad, and then by Aldfrith, a son by his second wife,
Yes.
Finn, who was an Irish princess. Aldfrith married Cuthber, sister of King Ina of Wessex, and together with her had Osred, and possibly Osric. Osric was the last king from the main line of Northumbrian kings. After his death, the throne...
And then it actually got quite complex, because it then went to someone from a different one of the houses.
passed to various, more distant relatives, starting with Ceolwulf. It was in Northumbria during the reign of Ceolwulf that the famous monk known as the Venerable Bede lived.
Yes.
Bede's many writings are arguably the most important sources for the Anglo-Saxon period. In fact, he is considered to be one of the most important historians from early Christian Europe. Okay.
He's also seen as he may have also fabricated some of these to be in the favour of Northumbria.
At this point, let's turn our attention to the Kingdom of Mercia, which was located just below Northumbria. The word Mercia comes from the word march, which
Yes.
at the time simply meant the borderlands. In Mercia's case, the name likely referred to the border between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons. So, initially its rulers were simply the leaders of the border folk, but eventually the area evolved into a kingdom that was officially known as Mercia. Their line starts with a man named Ichel, who, unlike all other Anglo-Saxon kings, actually had royal roots back on the continent.
Yes, he did.
He is said to have been the son of the last Anglic king of Germany. However, please keep in mind that the early genealogy for all of these families is a bit sketchy, and therefore
and it just comes from documents which we have no evidence to be true or false.
Should be taken with a grain of salt. For example, most of the Anglo-Saxon genealogies list all of these kings as going all the way back to the god of Woden, who is known in Norse mythology as Odin. The first really powerful king of Mercia was Penda, who I've already mentioned as being the last major pagan king from any of the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. However, after Penda's death, his sons converted to Christianity. Peada was the first to rule, but he did so as a subordinate to Oswy of Northumbria. He was murdered in less than a year, making his brother Wulfhere the next king. Wulfhere managed to gain back control of Mercia from Northumbria,
Somehow.
and it was during his reign that Mercia replaced Northumbria as the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdom.
So yeah, Mercia and Northumbria and Wessex kind of swapped quite a bit during this time as the leading power of England.
Wulfhere was followed by his brother Athelred, and then by his son Coenred, and then by Athelred's son Coelred. We then get to Athelbald, a descendant of Penda's brother. Athelbald reigned for 41 years, which is the longest verifiable reign for any Anglo-Saxon.
And it's a very long time at this time because you have to think, this being, 1,200 years ago, 1,400 years ago, it's a lot of time for that time. The average age would have been about 30 years old, would have been the average lifespan. So 41 years, and that is a very long time.
King. He was the dominant king when Bede was writing. However, Bede did not give him the title of Brett Worlder, presumably because Bede was writing to explain the past, not the present. Athelbald would likely have reigned even longer. However, he was assassinated, resulting in a brief civil war, which was won by a relative of his, named Offa. Offa of Mercia is generally seen as being the greatest of all the Anglo-Saxon kings prior to Alfred the Great. Some even consider him to be a precursor to the later kings of unified England. His reign coincided with the reign of another great king over on the continent, that of Charlemagne. In fact, the two corresponded several times on matters of diplomacy.
Yes, they actually did correspond, and we have some evidence to show that they actually got on very well, which is surprising because kings didn't really get along with each other when they were of different kingdoms, especially at this point in time.
At one point, it seemed that Charlemagne's heir would marry one of Offa's daughters. However, that didn't end up happening. Offa is also remembered for building Offa's Dyke, an 8-foot-high mound of earth that stretched 177 miles from the top of Wales all the way to the bottom, and to this day still roughly marks the border between England.
I've always wanted to go there and see it, and it's actually meant to be a beautiful spot, and it's actually I think it's classed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of what it is.
Wales. After a nice long reign of 39 years, Offa was succeeded by his son Edgefrith, and then by a distant relative named Coenwulf. However, in the decades that followed, Mercia started to decline, and Wessex would soon replace it as the dominant power. So, let's turn our attention to Wessex. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the royal line of Wessex is the line from which the current British royals descend. It started with a man named Cerdic. If you, like many people, are able to trace your lineage to one of the early Plantagenet kings of England, then Cerdic is also one of your ancestors, and probably...
And I actually can, but it's it's very distant because of how long ago this is.
The earliest ancestor that you can trace a line to with any certainty. However, keep in mind that during the lifetime of Cerdic, the Kingdom of Wessex didn't actually exist yet. And in fact...
No, it didn't exist for quite a while, actually, afterwards, and he tried to create it but couldn't.
He might not even have considered himself a king. Instead, he was probably simply a tribal leader,
Yes.
his tribe being known as the Yewisse. It was not until the reign of his great-grandson, Cerna, who was the first in the dynasty to convert to Christianity, that the title King of the West Saxons, or King of Wessex, was used.
But even then, it wasn't really a thing yet. It was just used, but wasn't a verifiable thing.
Was followed by his son Ken. However, early on in the reign of Caernwald, Wessex came under the direct control of Penda of Mercia for a few years.
Yes.
This is why you can see a gap in his regnal dates. Also, some sources indicate that, after his death, his wife Saxson reigned for about a year. If this was the case, it would be quite notable, as Saxson would be the only queen to rule in her own right during the entire Anglo-Saxon period.
Which is impressive, because actually Serbuk was also known for being very strong and independent at this time, which was extremely strange for the time, because of the fact that he was a patriarchy.
Earlier, Caernwald might also have married a sister of Penda. It is thought that Coenwulf of Mercia and his descendants may have descended from this line. Anyway, after Saxon, the throne jumped around a bit between several kings whose exact lineage is unknown,
and whose exact rule dates are also unknown.
Moving to a totally different branch of the family, the one that descended from Ceolin, who I mentioned earlier as being the second Bretwalda. The first king from this branch was Cadwalla, and then Inna. During their reigns, Wessex reached its greatest extent up to that point, dominating the kingdoms of Kent, Essex, and Sussex.
Yes.
However, after Inna, Wessex came under the influence of Mercia for almost...
And it kind of just then started to fall apart, what was basically almost an empire in the middle of England.
A century during the reigns of Athelbald and Offa, and the throne of Wessex jumped around between several more distant relatives. That all changed with the arrival of Egbert. Egbert was the great-great-grandson of Inna's brother, and his father had been appointed sub-king of Kent. Just prior to Egbert's reign, the throne of Wessex had been held by Beorhtric, a son-in-law, and therefore a likely puppet king of Offa. But Egbert managed to regain independence for Wessex, setting the
which was actually quite surprising, seeing the power on which Offa held.
Stage for Wessex to become the new dominant power. In fact, later chroniclers writing in Wessex listed Egbert as an 8th Bretwalda, which shows some obvious bias on their part because they skipped over the Mercian kings of Athelbald and Offa, who arguably deserved the title as well. Egbert was followed by his son Athelwulf, who was in turn followed by 4 of his sons in succession, the last of whom was Alfred the Great,
who was king of Wessex and then unified the Anglo-Saxons and then had to fight off the Vikings when they tried to invade in the 800s.
During the reign of the third son, Athelbert, a major event occurred that would eventually lead to the unification of England. That event was the arrival of the Great Heathen Army, a massive coalition of Vikings who launched a major attack along the eastern seaboard of Great Britain. Over the next several years, the Vikings were able to conquer much of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Essex. But after Alfred the Great came to the throne, the tide started to shift. In 878, Alfred fought the Viking leader Guthrum in the Battle of Edington.
A very famous battle that we don't actually know exactly where it took place, but we know roughly where it was. And honestly, it's meant to be a beautiful sight, and the history behind it is brilliant.
Won decisively. At this point, England was basically divided in two, with the Viking-controlled areas becoming known as the Danelaw, and the Anglo-Saxon areas coming under the rule of Alfred. In fact, in 886, Alfred declared himself to be the king of the Anglo-Saxons.
Yes.
He was followed by his son Edward the Elder, with his son-in-law Athelred, and later his daughter Athelflaed overseeing Mercia. Edward the Elder continued to gain ground against the Vikings, and 2 of his daughters married the most powerful rulers on the continent, Charles the Simple, king of the West Franks, and Otto the Great, king of the East Franks, who would
Very
go on
famous people.
to become the first real Holy Roman Emperor. Edward the Elder was followed by Athelstan, who in 927 defeated the final Viking stronghold at York and became the first king of a totally unified England.
And that's basically, and the borders were almost not changed since then.
Although at the time his actual title was King of the English. Thus marks the end of our journey. From this point on, the story continues in Matt's video on the British monarch's family tree, which traces the line from Athelstan all the way to Queen Elizabeth II. You can find a link to that video in the description. Before I go, I want to address one last thing. What about King Arthur, the most famous legendary king?
Most people don't think he's real anymore. Most historians think that now. Well, we think he was real, but not in the way that people actually, that the story goes.
Britain. Well, the key word there is legendary. King Arthur is said to have lived in the days following Hengist and Horsa. And keep in mind that he was a Briton, not an Anglo-Saxon.
Yes.
So he would have been on the side fighting against the Anglo-Saxon invasion. But everything we know about King Arthur comes from legends that were written many, many centuries after his supposed lifetime. Although there are several historical characters who have been put forward as possible inspirations for King Arthur, the fact of the matter is that there is actually no historical evidence for his existence. But if you want to hear more about King Arthur and his fictional family tree, we do have a video on that. I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. Finally, I'll also leave a link to my own channel, a long time ago. I've got lots of videos about Anglo...
Anyway, it's the end of the video, so remember to like, subscribe and all that, and like, subscribe to Useful Charts, and bye.